Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
It was such an interesting read. I met Jeff at Associated Writing Programs, AWP. We were on a panel together on the shape of the novel. And I remember other people were on that panel too and just talked about their own books. But Jeff talked about literature. And whatever we talked about, he was there. You know, he could go. And so I was just waiting to see what he wrote and to see this book. It's both a page-turner, but the form is very interesting. It's told in very short sections. So if somebody reads a lot, they start to see, kind of the literary base note going on. But if they're not particularly literary, they just go, wow, cool, short sections, moves along, this is really rock and roll, it's great, it's a 3-minute song. So it can be read, it's multi-leveled that way. You can read it, with a literary eye, or you can just read it as a fast-moving rock and roll novel. But it is a surreal novel, and or is it? Did you sit down, did you have a feel for kind of the level of reality?
I mean, it was more surreal when I started it, unfortunately. Like, my notes for this book go back over 10 years. And the first image that came to me was this idea. It was this image of someone in a rock club, in a small rock club, being shot on stage. And so 12 years ago, that really did seem like a very surreal image. This is well before the Bataclan shooting. And this sort of idea of this sort of epidemic of shootings that seemed unstoppable also felt more surreal. And in some ways it feels like reality's caught up to the book in some very unsettling ways that were never my intention. But it is surreal in that there is sort of like a dream logic operating with within the book, that there's definitely a lot of reality to the book, but there's also a fair amount of dreaminess and a little bit of hallucinatoriness that's floating through it as well, and that's certainly intentional. It felt right to tell this sort of heightened story with a slightly heightened level of sort of dream logic guiding the characters and guiding the story that hopefully makes sense while you read it, but maybe when you look back on it, you're like, wait, how did we get to this point exactly?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, isn't that why we like rock and roll, especially, as a young fan, because you leave the world, you enter a heightened world, you enter a mythic world, even maybe genres of rock you might not like particularly, have a very mythic quality to them, and people want, especially the importance of rock in a smaller kind of Rust Belt town or suburb or places where you feel, the fans often feel like the only place that there's any meaning is in those clubs, and they'll spend hours, and you describe that so well, you spend hours getting your nail polished, getting your eye makeup, getting the clothes right.
And it feels like so much is sort of riding on like these performances that like very few, that's no one ever outside the town is going to know about.
Right. Yeah, there's so much riding on them, and so there comes the question of, is there a pattern to the kinds of bands that get shot? Are they as good as their mythology?
Well, I mean, throughout the book, as you'll see, characters have different theories on why the shootings are taking place. And one of the theories that's floating around from the character Xenie, in fact, is that it's it's these bands that are really mediocre, that aren't very good, that there's something about almost sort of a culling of the herd that's happening with this, that there become, she says at one point that it's, everyone's in a band, and the most interesting thing you could do these days would be to not be in a band, or to break up your band. And so I think part of that's a reaction to sort of like the mediocrity that she sees, but I think part of it's also a reaction to the fact there's such a sort of information overload that we're saturated in, and it's not just like small-time music scenes, it's all around us. There's a lot of interesting art that's made out there, a lot of interesting music. I mean, the book isn't making the argument that it's like music used to be better back then. It's not the case. Like there's always really interesting music being made, and there's certainly still a lot of interesting music being made now. But I think we're at a situation where the interesting music that's being made now doesn't have the possibility of meaning as much as it used to mean. It doesn't have the possibility of sort of moving the cultural needle anymore. And there's a sort of cultural spark that's missing, not just for musicians, but for fans, that helps to sort of create some identity and a sense of community around certain bands and certain musicians. And when there isn't sort of a critical mass or even sort of a listening mass around something like that becomes missing. And so another theory that's floating through the book is the killers are in some weird way trying to get back to some sort of year zero in some sort of really horrific way, in some less than a punk rock way, more of a Khmer Rouge way. But I mean, there are a bunch of different theories as to why. But I do think that one of the things that's definitely is sort of inescapable is how do you make art that means something in a culture where it's really hard to tell the signal from the noise? And how do you give stakes to your art when it feels like no one's listening and no one's paying attention? Like, how do you create those stakes for yourself when you're a musician and it's hard to get people to get together to rehearse more than once a week because there's no chance you're going to make any money at it?
Yeah, it's like the relationship between art and commerce comes up in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, in rock and roll, weirdly, like a lot of great art in rock and roll has come out of money. It's come out of the fact that there's money involved, I mean, John Lennon and Paul McCartney getting together to say, like, we're going to write a swimming pool today. We're going to write a car. We're going to, that in some ways, like, having, like, the carrot of money dangled in front of people has been really beneficial for art. And the fact that even, really strange avant-garde groups could like tour Europe and make money, allowed them to stay together and make their wonderful, strange, defiantly sort of uncommercial music because there was still some money in it.
That's a paradox.
Yeah, it is. It is like, that's like the weird paradox of like popular music, I think, is that sometimes when there was money involved, it was actually beneficial.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, don't we always turn to art for that kind of heightened quality, that mythic quality that our lives are just, I don't want to say they're, I mean, you experiencing as an increasing lack of meaning, that maybe it's, the fragmentation of groups. I mean, it's the essence of rock and roll that it's a group, right? It's the band. We a small group of people who have a vision, and we have often have a style, and we have, we create our world, and the fans join that, and it adds a whole dimension to life. And without, I can't think of another form that has such a I was thinking of Mary Gaitskill's novel Veronica, which she won the National Book Award several years ago for this book. And music has a lot to do with it because it's thinking about the 60s and saying that we saw the music we saw the surface of the music, and then there was a door that you could walk in and be part of that heightened, more glamorous, more exciting world. And I see the fans, you can do that in rock and roll. There's very few other art forms that are quite, that you do it with groups of people like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's about, I mean, I think so much of like the appeal of rock is this idea of self-transformation. And that even liking different types of music can be like a different way of transforming yourself, of like identifying yourself as liking this sort of thing. I mean, I read there's a really interesting music memoir that came out a couple of years ago by Vivian Albertine. Any of you all know that book? She was the guitar player for the Slits, and she was sort of around sort of at ground zero of punk in the UK in the 70s, and has all these sort of amazing stories to tell about just about what was happening then. Like she was in Sid Vicious's first band, and she was dating Mick Jones from The Clash, and she learned how to play guitar from Keith Levine from PIL and all these other things. But what's interesting is she says she was like 14 and 15, and she's like, I was interested in where the action was. Like that's what I was interested in. And she said where the action was back then was music, and that's why I got involved. And she said if I was 14 or 15 now, I wouldn't be involved in music.
What would she be doing?
She said she wasn't sure. She said she thought, her answers she gave were very unsatisfying, I thought. She was like, medicine was one.
At 14?
Yeah, I don't know. I was like, what? That's not true. And another one was science, which I don't know, sounds good, but I don't know. It didn't, neither of her answers like made any sense to me. But I understood like the impulse that she was talking about. And she has a daughter who's like 16, and she's sort of interested in music, but it's neither sort of the life raft it was for her, and it's also not the sort of tool of transformation and this sort of sense of like it's the action to get in on.
It's, I can remember going down the Strip and seeing the kids sitting on the wall outside of the Whiskey, because they were too young to get in. And actually, the coolest people at that concert were the people sitting on the wall. You know, it just had, the fans, I mean, if it's not a world, if it's not exciting, even the proximity of that doorway, it's like it isn't rock and roll anymore.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think in some ways the book is also about, like, what do you do with an art form after it sort of outlives its existence, outlives its usefulness in a certain way.
Well, let's talk about literature, because it's not just a rock and roll novel, it is also a novel.
Yes.
You know, so how do your comments on rock and roll reflect on your ideas about where fiction's at?
I mean, weirdly, I feel like the internet has like totally has done something really terrible to music. It's really swallowed it up and sort of stripped away a lot of sort of the lore around it. And partly that's because like songs are 3 minutes. It only takes 3 minutes to listen to a song. And it's starting to do that to films, but films is like 90 minutes, so it's a little bit longer. I feel like weirdly, like books have been in this way like slightly impervious to the internet because it just takes so damn long to read a book. And weirdly, the internet has sort of helped connect people to like find sort of stranger books. I mean, the sort of caveat to all this is maybe the internet has destroyed people's attention span, so like not many people read anymore. But I do feel like in some ways like literature is somehow is somewhat healthier than music in terms of all this, but I think there is still the same issue of just there's so much out there in terms of like how much is published every year and how many really good books are published every year and how hard it is for a lot of them to find their audience is a tough thing.
But I think that too, the literature is, because of the internet, because of the sheer amount of stuff that people are exposed to on an average evening of web surfing, I think it's been helpful to break down some of the genre boundaries.
Yeah.
People are not as tough, oh, that's poetry, or oh, that's science fiction. It's like, no, it's, I can read stuff, a novel, younger people can read a novel in verse and don't find it upsetting, or they can read a novel that in form seems a little bit unconventional to a conventional reader, but to a younger reader, it's just like, oh, cool, little short pieces, I can go with that. Oh, this is happening. Is that the same guy as this? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Let's just see what happens. Where a reader from, say, the 1940s might just not have wrapped their head around this. I think there's the label experimental fiction. It used to be anything that wasn't conventional narrative, realist fiction, was put in this experimental category. And I think that's been exploded. People realize, oh, that's not an experiment, that's a novel. They're not as put off by the unusual.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think readers have become a lot more adventurous. I think it's in some cases the major publishing houses that are slow to understand some of this. I think there's starting to be gaps in that. But when my first novel, Mira Corpora, came out, it was called, super experimental, and people are going to have a really hard time understanding this. And, most of the emails I got about that book from readers were from 18, 19-year-old and 20-year-olds who read it in 2 nights and found it just this immersive, interesting, propulsive story, and weren't sort of concerned about the formal qualities of this, that, or the other. And it was really heartening that I felt okay, there are plenty of readers out there who engage with this, and it's not about it being some rarefied thing. There's a lot of sort of odd moves in Destroy All Monsters, including sort of the A side and the B side. And there's even sort of the way time works in the novel. There's cross-cutting in it that's almost sort of filmic. But those things are there structurally not to sort of show off some different technique, but they're there to actually make the story more immersive and more propulsive and more sort of to sort of hook you in deeper. They're there because they have to be there to sort of serve part of what that's doing.
So how did you get the publisher to do this? Believe me, 10 years ago, they would have said no.
Well, there are a lot of publishers who would have just said no too. I was really lucky. Interestingly enough, when the book was sold, the publisher had just read the A side, and they didn't even know the B side was around. And I was like, well, there's this other side, and I had been writing this B side. I'd sort of once I had finished the book, I sort of became haunted by the idea of the book as sort of a single, and I started thinking of it as an A side. And I started to think, well, then what is the B side? And I had some friends who were this book is hard enough to sell already. You're making it twice as hard to sell. You're crazy. I just couldn't shake the idea. And when I was writing it, I thought, well, maybe it's a standalone thing that could be published separately. Maybe someone else will publish it, and they'll sort of speak to each other. But after I had finished the B side, I really realized that it needed to be under the same covers. And initially, the publisher was like, "Oh, well, we can publish them just sort of one after the other." And I'm like, "No, you have to flip the book because it's not part 1 and part 2, which you'll see when you read it. It's really." The B side is really sort of an alternate history of the A side. And you might see some of the same events, but they're going to turn out differently. And you might see some of the same characters, but their genders might be different. Some characters might meet different fates. There'll be echoes throughout the book, but the echoes are going to lead to different places. And so I really wanted that sort of mental shift that you have to do when you turn the book over. And so I was really lucky that the publisher got this and understood it. It took them a little while to wrap their head around it because they bought one book and they got something much stranger. I think much better too.
It is. It's really interesting because it's a really exciting story. Just a plain old murder mystery, if you want to go that way. It's a really exciting story with some really haunting elements to it. It has kind of a little bit of a horror side to it. shall I say. And then you flip it, it's like,
Good Halloween reading.
it's not an opposite story, it's like a counter narrative. So it's not like, actually the way I see it is blah, 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 but everything is told in a somewhat different way.
Yeah, no, I mean, even like the point of view is like
Yeah.
is tweaked and slightly different.
Yeah.
And you're partly getting information. There are partly some scenes that are mentioned in the A side but aren't dramatized, that are dramatized in here. But there are also like some really major scenes that aren't in the A side that are shown in the
Yeah.
B side and in very different ways, and the characters interacting in very different ways.
Yeah, didn't you say somewhere that the B side is the band's secret, is going to be on the B side?
Yeah, that the characters talk about like what do you prefer, A sides or B sides? And one of the characters says, one of the musicians says, I'm always trying to write A sides, but I actually prefer B sides. And the other character says something like that. I like B sides too, because where the bands tend to hide their secrets, their obsessions. Although there might be more secrets hidden on the A side of this particular book, actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then, let's see, I actually prepared one or two questions. There have been, there are a number of books where we get twice told stories. Were they affecting you, or did the idea of having that second, the B side, just come out of a need to address some of these hidden or unopened boxes of story?
I mean, it partly came out of that. I mean, I don't know that I wasn't sort of working off of models for this, but I'm always thinking about this great trilogy of novels by Agota Christoph, this Hungarian writer. It's called The Book of Lies. And it's 3 novels, The Notebook, The Proof, and the third book in the volume is called The Third Lie. It's the best title ever for like a third volume in your trilogy. And it's an amazing set of books because each novel rewrites and recontextualizes the previous book. And so each one forces you to sort of rethink what you thought you knew about that. And that book has really haunted me and continues to really haunt me. I highly recommend it. Grove puts out a compendium of all 3 books. They're really short. I mean, it's like 600 pages for all 3 books, 500 pages. Anyway, and so I was really interested in that. I was really interested in the idea of a side that addresses, the B side addresses the A side, but it also erases and rewrites and recontextualizes the A side. That really forces you to think of the A side in a completely different way, and the characters and the connections and even a lot of the images that you've seen in the A side are completely sort of wrenched into a different shape. And so her book was like was really powerful for me, and it still is. I still think about that book a lot and how she did it. Probably also somewhere in the back of my mind, there's the Dennis Cooper's last novel, The Marbled Swarm. Sort of each chapter, I almost think of it as like each chapter if each chapter is like a hand of solitaire, it's like each chapter then reshuffles the deck and deals itself a new set of cards. And it's the same characters and situations and all that, but somehow it's a different configuration. In each chapter, you're sort of like, whoa, where exactly am I? And I love that sort of sense of disorientation. I'm not doing something quite that radical as he was chapter by chapter, but it's something I always
Did you
really
read
loved.
I the Divine by Rabbi Alamedine?
Oh, no, that's on my
Where
list
he
to read. But I haven't.
retells the first chapter of a novel over and over, trying to start it right. And it's just in different styles. He begins this book again and again. It is a brilliant.
Oh, wow.
It is a brilliant book.
That sounds very sort of
when
Calvino-ish, too.
Yeah, when we're in Jeff Jackson territory, then we start looking at some interesting novels, the way they're put together.
Yeah.
Let's see. We talked about over an early dinner. We talked about what have you stolen from other books? Have because writers, of course, try not to steal. It's up to us to create things freshly for the reader and be very honest about it being fresh always. But we always steal from the people we love because we can't resist. It's so wonderful. And so we talked about that. So tell us about your one borrowing.
Well, maybe more than one, but I was really interested. There's this Nabokov. I always mispronounce.
Nabokov.
Okay, Nabokov.
Yeah.
Anyway, novella called Transparent Things that I was really interested in. It's not like one of his greatest work, but it's a really fascinating one. And it's narrated from beyond the grave. And there are definitely some elements in Destroy All Monsters that's in conversation with that book. Some sections that it's hard to tell, that don't maybe seem like they're being narrated, but there's a narrated embedded in there. And there's sort of the last line of Transparent Things when the character that's being described, this character Hugh Person is his name. He dies in this fire, and as he's dying, there's described sort of the mental maneuver that happens between sort of life and death. And the narrator welcomes him to the other side by talking about this mental maneuver that makes. He says, "Easy, does it, son?" And so you might hear some echoes of that somewhere in the book.
Look for that. Well, let's see. I left my marked up copy at dinner, but
hopefully it's not walked away.
Yeah, no, it'll still be there. I'm picturing it, yellow on a yellow table. What does it mean for a novel to be absolutely modern?
When I think about, I guess when I think about like a novel, like I think about like a novel should be novel. A novel should feel like it's doing something new. I feel like that's really important. That if you're going to take your time, like not to be watching serialized TV, which is really good, like you should be like reading something that's going to give you something that only fiction can give you. And that comes in terms of the form as well as the voice or any number of other functions. But there's so many things competing for our attention these days that I really feel like fiction has to do something really special. And the book should feel like something it feels fresh. It feels like something you haven't read before, maybe even if it is. I think that's sort of the trick of rock and roll too, is like it's not that it's necessarily new, but it sounds like it's new. And I think a novel should feel novel.
It should. It's, and we're always in conversation with what we're reading, rather than trying to replicate it. People are writing, sequels to books or prequels to books that were written 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and suddenly we have it from a different character's point of view, or we're retelling it with the concerns of the present. So in a way, this issue of authenticity, which comes up in your book a lot, it's if you're having, are you trying to imitate, say, Moby Dick or whatever book you're in conversation with? Are you trying to imitate that, or are you in conversation with it? Because I had a long talk with somebody who was arguing that, that's it's imitation. We don't need it,
Yeah.
Whereas art it's a freeway that's already in motion. You get on the freeway, and you join the conversation.
There's a book of sculptures that came out very recently by this guy Jack Whitten, this painter, and this is his body of work. He apparently been doing his entire life and hadn't shown until just recently. He just passed away. It's like 40 years life work. And I've been it's a fascinating book. I've been reading a lot of interviews with him recently. I've sort of become a little obsessed with Jack Whitten. And he talks about, it was when he was a young painter, it was really important for him. I forget, I think it was de Kooning told him, when you get in the studio, all the history of art is behind you. You know, that you're not alone in the studio, that there's all this you can be drawing from. And I feel like that's true when you're writing, and sometimes that feels like a crushing weight, and other times it feels like like wind in your sails. But you are, I mean, hopefully the work you're doing is sort of part of that stream, part of that conversation. I mean, one of the things we were talking about at AWP that I thought was really great, and one of the things you were pointing out, is just all the sort of different types of structures a novel can have. And then I think that one of the sort of failures of imagination of sort of contemporary American realist fiction is that there's so many forms that are unused. There's so many forms from around the world that are really exciting that still feel very fresh, that haven't sort of been engaged with. And it's a shame that doesn't, happen more often. That isn't seen as sort of like, instead of a strange thing to be avoided, but like an opportunity to lean into.
Are you thinking of something in particular?
In terms of like problematic books? Or
No, of forms that have, that have languished, that we could, why aren't we trying to do that?
I mean...
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Well, I mean, one of the things you were talking about was Under the Volcano, and sort of the idea of, just different ways to like arrange the novel. And one of them is sort of like an obsessive sort of patterning, that something doesn't have to be plot driven. There's an obsessive patterning of images and phrases that keep sort of like that. This is constellation of patterns is what holds the novel together. Mm-hmm. There's this great Julio Cortázar book, 62, A Model Kit, that is, it's narrated by multiple people at the same time. And it moves through time and space in this really crazy way. It takes a little while to like figure out, like, get into like the mindset of the novel, but once you do, it's incredible. And it's this idea of multiple narrators like really works in a really interesting way, and sort of the way he collapses time and space while still telling this story that takes place over like a month is just fascinating. So I mean, it's either like, something like Life, a User's Manual, the Perec, it can be sort of like, you can sort of find a new way to do like the Arabian Nights, style of storytelling, but like arrange it in a way that feels very modern.
This is a crazy novel where the whole novel is this guy describing the contents of the rooms of a Parisian apartment house. It's done like in the Knight's Gambit, so it's up 1 over 2 or down 1 over 2, and you get everything about those people, about the politics. Everybody still remembers who was a collaborator in World War II and what their apartment looks like, and the poor people live up near the ceiling, and the wealthy people live on the first floor, the one right up from the street, the premier etage, and the. I remember it was 500 pages. I started reading it, like, what? Why am I reading this again? But it's full of games. Like he has to have these 20 things in the room. He can't use this. He can't use this. This is the guy who wrote a whole novel without using the letter E, and managed to do it. So the games of those, writers.
Yeah.
Like, why not?
Yeah, I mean, there's some wild stories in that book. I mean, there is some, like, a friend of mine says that, like, Antiques Roadshow is like Perec porn because it's the description of all the. But I mean, they're like, that book is full of like things that are somewhat more sort of intellectual, but also like some really wild, like swashbuckling, funny tales in there too. Yeah. I mean, there's just a lot of different sort of containers for the novel that just aren't typically used, that I think like readers would be like fascinated to come in contact with.
Right. So should we open this?
Yeah. Do people have questions? Yeah. Don't be shy. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're talking a lot about rock and roll and everything. So I've gotten
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, there are still I think there's this need for people to sort of create this stuff. I mean, it's interesting though, Kendrick Lamar was complaining before he won the Pulitzer about how quickly his album Damn disappeared and how it didn't have a moment. And I was like, if Kendrick Lamar's complaining that he doesn't have enough sort of cultural clout, what chance do so many younger artists have? Yeah, I mean, I remember, people talk about, the song of the summer. Well, the song of the summer lasts a week now, And so I still think you're right that those things are still happening. It probably has moved to hip hop, which is for younger people for sure. But there is still this sort of sense of of this accelerated pace and how that's sort of even eating up those. I mean, I wonder how long do the Xanax rap thing last? Does that have many legs 6 months from now?
Do you think it's because they eat up the things? There's such a short gap between the appearance of something really creative and the commercialization of it. It's such a short gap.
Apparently, I read about all that these songs don't even come out. They're just on SoundCloud.
Right.
So they're not even being published, ultimately.
Well, I think it's just that it's the internet, right? So it's fashion is faster. Who's collectors now is even with books, it's a little different for YA, I guess, but you need a novella. The book needs to come out next year, but we need another one to carry the fans over. It's now more, fast. Then I had another unrelated question.
Yeah, sure.
So your concept is really crazy. I was like, this sounds nuts in a really good way. But at the same time, we've had so many mass shootings and everything. I was wondering, well, how long ago did you write the book, and were you kind of having a dialogue with that, or was it?
The dialogue, this has always been a violent country, and that's always been on my mind. So in that sense, there was a dialogue with that. But it wasn't sort of... So for instance, when I first had drafted some of the scenes of the killings, I showed them to some friends, and this was pre-Sandy Hook, and the comments I got from friends was this is unrealistic that there could be this many killings and that there wouldn't be a public outcry and the government wouldn't stop to intervene. And I was like, well, I'm not trying to write a realist book, so that's fine. But, the sad thing is this has become something, has become something that I never expected. And sort of the rate at which this has changed. I finished this book. It took a while to sell it. It took a while to edit it and get it published. And so even just the way attitudes have been changing, even just post the Florida shooting earlier this year, has been happening so fast that it's definitely sort of recontextualizing the book a little bit beyond sort of what I had intended, And that's been weird for me as an author to put something, to be putting something out there that feels like it's more intentionally I'm in dialogue with this thing that I wasn't actually really intending to be in this sort of close dialogue with. So that's been weird, and I don't know. The book also has, the book has a real sort of current event feel. One of the nice things, there's Don DeLillo read it, and one of the things he said about it was he was very complimentary, is that it read to him like an old folk tale. It was really nice that it had sort of both, and that's something I'm definitely going for, that it has this sort of ritualistic, older feel to it that hopefully helps it sort of live beyond this moment, while it is definitely sort of more of this moment that I intended it to be originally. Does that answer that?
Yeah, because you never know the context that a book is going to come out.
History feels like it's just moving so fast in general. Who knows what crazy batshit thing is going to be happening next week that we're all going to be clutching our heads over, that may really radically rewrite the context that some book is read in and perceived as, or some book that may seem to be really of interest on sort of the cutting edge and is bought, and when it's published a year later, everyone's moved on to something else. So it's, in that sense, literature is a very poor way to sort of keep up with the zeitgeist.
But the zeitgeist is moving you. You don't even know that, I mean, you certainly pick up on there's always been a kind of a violent substrate in rock and roll. You know, everybody who's been to a concert and there's an energy in the air, and it's just like you make sure, like, where are the exits? I mean, seriously, you do. Or you might, you know, give up your seat and move a little further back, you know? That there has been, you know, a feel of violence, depending on the band, of course.
And it goes back. I mean, the book is one of the A side. There are dedications for each side. And the A side is dedicated to the singer Johnny Ace, who is a sort of really early rock and roll sort of crooner from like the 50s. And he, after one concert on a Christmas Eve night, he was challenged to a game of Russian roulette and played it and lost. And the song he had recorded 2 nights before, the song called Pledging My Love, went to #1 immediately. And he was sort of the first rock and roll casualty and the first sort of like, you know, it was his youth and his death was written into the lore of his music. And in fact, that song, Pledging My Love, which plays a really important part in the book, is considered to be a haunted and a cursed song. It was the very last song that Elvis Presley recorded, and there's several other people who covered it who, like, bad things have happened to them.
The Scottish song.
Yeah, it is. It is. Pledging My Love is like the, you know. But it's interesting that like this idea of danger in rock and roll goes back to like the days of Johnny Ace, and that's why I wanted side A of the book to be dedicated to him, because he's sort of the one that sort of in some ways sets this in motion. Yeah, don't. Well, you know, playing Russian roulette, not really the smartest.
But it's that whole feeling of heightened reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I read that it's hard for musicians today, whether it's internet or Amazon or whatever, to have a clean path to commercial success. Because you can't just like sign with a record company anymore and
Yeah.
sell as many records. But you know, I go to the club scene a lot, and like, at least in LA, and I'm assuming other major cities too, the DJs are playing wonderful new stuff that and the bands do tour, and so the energy does still feel like it's there to me at least, and I sort of challenge your idea that there's no hunger in new music, because at least for me it is, and
I think it's not about.
It may not be on the radio, but you know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the argument I'd be making is that it's really more about how it's able to sort of affect the culture more than the energy of the music itself. Like, there's still lots of good music being made. I think it's like the impact it's able to have.
Yeah, well, mine's less the mainstream culture than probably various subcultures. So yeah,
Yeah.
I would say that within the subcultures it can have an impact, but maybe not in the broader culture. It's not Lady Gaga talking about, of course. So, you know.
Right. And even she's had to reinvent herself as a movie star. But yeah, no, I mean, I know what you're saying. I mean, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina now, and there's like a pretty interesting sort of underground scene. But it's hard though when those bands like they're around for a couple of years and break up, because it's just not. I don't know. There's no money in touring anymore. It's sort of like you see people at least at the level. Maybe it's probably different in LA. It sort of becomes a hobby, and there's something. It's really only sort of the people who are real lifers who are sort of like really sticking to it. And I see so many people sort of pass through the scene that are really interesting, doing interesting work, and just sort of like pass out of it again.
Well, I think that, rock and roll is such a dream. And once you stop dreaming that intense, it's hard to keep up that intensity of a dream if there's nowhere to go. If we're just showing up in Charlie's living room, then we do a gig at the Bigfoot Tavern, and then we're back in Charlie's living room.
Yeah, right.
And you're getting to be, you're 25, you're 35. Where's that intensity going to come from that used to sustain people?
Yeah.
So, like, there's the cultural zeitgeist, and artists should be picking up on this, and artists should be dreaming that dream. And because the rapidity of the history and the movement and then capitalism, so aren't journalists like Minutemen on the bridge of culture? Aren't these the deliverers of, aren't these the catalysts and agents of our music, of our literature, of our media, these journalists, because they're telling us these stories, they're scripting these stories of our culture, afresh and anew each day, right?
I mean, in terms of like the facts, sure. In terms of creating art, in terms of creating something that, like you were saying, that people want to dream their way into. I mean, I still think that's the role of art. That's the news that William Carlos Williams said people die from every day, not being in the newspapers.
And you can't help it. You know, if you're an artist, people say, you know, some people write specifically topical art. They try to deal with what is happening right now, and that goes onto the page. But a lot of artists, you know, are writing about kind of how how life appears to them. But even that work is political. If you read it 10 years from now, if you read it 20 years from now, you see how the artist cannot help but express the times, whether they intended to do it or not. So you look at Kandinsky as a painter. He began abstraction in the 1910s. And you can see World War I right there on the canvas. Well, this is, you know, at least 2 years, 3 years before the war. But you could already see the war brewing. You know, we can't help but pull it through because we live in time, we live in history. It affects us. So you felt this violence and the myth, you know, these things coming together. I think, you know, it just comes through. How could it not?
Yeah. I mean, I think too, I mean, to just back to your point, I think hopefully you could, you know, disagree with a lot of what's in the book or some of the ideas that the characters are positing in the book, and still hopefully the book still has a lot else that like makes it a satisfying read. Like it's not just like we're talking about some of like the more topical stuff because that's a little bit easier to talk about. But I mean, I think that's also the thing about art is that it's hopefully giving you something from a number of different angles, that it's not the thing that may seem right in front of you may not be the thing that sticks with you from a given piece of literature or a given piece of music or whatever. I don't know.
I still think there are these accelerated times, like during the revolution, like now, where fashion, in the imitation of peasant wear, and pamphleteering, and Yankee Doodle music, and everything in the culture converged to create this powerful front that indicated before and after change. And I think we're in that fulcrum right now. Maybe we're sitting in the eye of it and not feeling it.
Yeah.
I think it's, I think you have to be, no matter what discipline you practice, and especially journalists, you would have to be absolutely unsentient not to see that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is like a deeply troubled, tumultuous time for sure. I mean, we're seeing changes happening in the culture that, you know, we've never seen before.
And I think your style really reflects it. The style of this book, the short scenes, there's a real pace to it, you know, that I think reflects, you know, it has the feel of the present.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in like things being fragmented, like how to take fragments but still make them propulsive. How to take fragments and show that they're incomplete but still make them sort of sing and still make you feel like you're getting something from that fragmentation. I mean, I think the fragmentation in the book is partly sort of the fragmentation of the culture, but it's also the fragmentation of the violence that happens. So like the book, most of it takes place in this small town of Arcadia after this sort of epidemic of violence. And it's these characters dealing with sort of the aftermath of this violence. And sort of, I think there's something about encountering this sort of violence that makes their lives feel shattered, that makes, one of the characters even says at one point that it's hard for him to think past the next couple of moments. And there's something about the book has trouble thinking past the next couple of moments. And I feel like in some ways we're all sort of like living that now with like, what the fuck is going to be on the news like tomorrow that we're going to have to like process, and how are we going to even, how do we think past that? Like we're sort of in this sort of stunted attention span because there's only so much we can take in. And I think the book style is in some ways reflecting that.
So I see that we're wrapping it up, and
I'll answer other questions too.
Yeah.
Like private,
But we're
come up and
gonna-
ask.
Let's thank them very much for
thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.